We are in the midst of the Vietnam War in 1968. An elderly rebel plans a daring attack from a hidden bunker. What is the target? To attack the southern stronghold of the enemy and force them to flee the nation. Even though his health is deteriorating, he remains resolute in the face of the enormous challenges and dangers that lie ahead. The Vietnam War, which will decide the country's fate, is about to start. Who was this man? Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnam War hero who conquered Americans. In what is now central Vietnam, the man whose name is Ho Chi Minh is born, Nguyen Sinh Cung, on May 19, 1890, in the hamlet of Kim Lien, province of Nha An, in the territory that was once under French protectorate of Annam. A scholar called Hoang Duong adopted Nguyen Sinh Sac, who was orphaned when he was young, and schooled him in the Confucian classics. The daughter of Sac's adopted father, Hoang Thi Lan, was his bride in 1883. The newlyweds settled into a little shack next to the Hoang residence. In the 7 years that followed, they would welcome 3 children into the world. One of them would be Ho Chi Minh in 1890. Nguyen Sinh Sac spent this time preparing for the civil service exams, while his wife cared for the children and worked the rice fields. A turbulent era in Vietnam's history occurred in the 19th century. Imperial China to the north has exerted a strong effect on the region's culture and lifestyle from the early 1st century BC. For a long time, Vietnam was free from Chinese authority. However, there were other times when China's strong authority made Vietnam a vassal state of its more powerful northern neighbor. Due to the cyclical instability of the Ming and Qing dynasties in China, Vietnam, mostly known as Dai Viet in pre-modern times, had relative independence beginning in the 15th century. The southern warlord Nu Nan became Emperor Gia Long of Dai Viet, or Great Viet, in 1802 at the start of the 19th century, after defeating his competitors. Vietnam became the official name of the nation 2 years after that. Nu Nan had a small French contingent that helped him ascend to the throne. Several European nations, including France, England, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands, sent explorers, merchants, and missionaries to Vietnam in the 17th century, in an effort to establish a presence in the Far East. During the early part of the 19th century, the area saw an influx of French missionaries. The Catholic missionaries were seen by the Vietnamese monarchy as a political danger. By the 1850s, French colonization of Cochin China included the southern third of Vietnam by 1867, after the outbreak of hostilities between the French and Vietnamese in 1858 in Annam and northern Vietnam, now the protectorate of Tonkin, occurred in 1885, despite Chinese efforts to intervene on the Vietnamese side. Despite the fact that the capital of the Nguyen dynasty, Hue, was under the control of the French, Indochina was effectively ruled by Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The colonial rulers in Vietnam were confronted with many Vietnamese uprisings in the late 1800s. The official scholar Phan Dinh Phum rose up in Nha An province in 1885. Even though Phung and his revolutionaries fought the French for almost 10 years, he was unable to reassert the Nguyen emperor's ultimate control before his sickness took his life in January 1896. Nguyen Sinh Sac kept studying and eventually established a school to help local youngsters earn money for their families, even though he did not pass the regional exams in 1891. He reapplied in 1894 and finally earned the Kun Nan, which is the same as a master's degree. Sac was presented with a piece of land as a token of his success, which was an uncommon honor for the town. He failed the imperial tests when he traveled to Hue the next spring to take them. He went to the Imperial Academy in the capital and stayed there, only taking a short trip back to his native province to see his wife and 2 boys. They didn't spend long there. Up in the nation's capital, the family settled into an apartment close to the royal palace. While watching the palace guards conduct exercises and parade, the little boys learned the classics of Confucianism from their father. After Sak's second consecutive failure on the imperial test in 1898, he took a teaching position in the neighboring village of Duongno, where he exposed the two boys to the Chinese language. Next, Sak departed from the city in August 1900 to fulfill his responsibilities as an exams clerk in Thanh Ngo, a northern province in Vietnam. Kum, who was 10 years old at the time, stayed in Hue with his expectant mother, who was expecting her fourth child, while his older brother went to live with their father. On February 10, 1901, not long after giving birth to a boy, she became unwell and passed away. When Sak learned of his wife's death, he hastened to the capital to return to the countryside with the children, even though he had taken a detour to Kim Lin on his way back to Hue. Young Kum's father's job security was questionable in French-ruled Vietnam, and he had already lost his mother at the tender age of 11. Even though there was a lot of turmoil, Kum was still making good academic progress during this time. When he returned to his hometown, his father put his schooling in the hands of a local scholar named Vuong Thuc Do. Vuong's older sibling had been a comrade of Phan Dinh Phung's during the resistance to French colonization, and he loved to regale his pupils with tales of Vietnam's heroic patriots. Sak went back to Hue, like heights, and climbed the hills in the area. A shrine dedicated to Nguyen Duc Du, a commander who fought against the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, stood atop one of the hills. A second-class doctorate, or Po Bang, was bestowed to his father after he completed his examinations at Hue on the third attempt. Despite this tremendous honor, Sak was uninterested in working for a French bureaucracy. Quoc Nu, a Latin script, was pushed and eventually made necessary in 1910 by the French colonial authority in Vietnam. This was in contrast to the Vietnamese elite's familiarity with the Chinese alphabet. Nguyen Sin Kum was 11 years old when Sak went back to the village to teach. The name Nguyen Tak Tan, which means he who will succeed, was bestowed to Sak's kid in keeping with Confucian tradition. Pan went to school in the hamlet next door after starting off at his father's school. In the end, he went back to school with his dad, who thought that education should focus more on developing good character than on cramming for tests. Despite his enjoyment of reading Journey to the West and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, young Pan was frustrated that the majority of his school books focused on Chinese history instead of Vietnamese history. In 1901, he once trekked 10 kilometers to Vinh, the provincial seat, to purchase Vietnamese history books. However, he was unable to afford them, so he had to settle with memorizing important parts and then would recite them to his pals when he got home. Pan wanted to study French and understand the French even though he grew up in an anti-French milieu. He attended a Vinh school that was bilingual, French and Vietnamese, in September 1905. His brother and Pan followed their father to Hue in 1906 when he took a higher-paying government position. There, they attended the Dong Ba School. Vietnamese, French, and Chinese language classes were offered to them there. The boys' sophomore year at college was bugs. French authorities in Hue established the National Academy in 1896 to provide a Western-style education to future government officials. Pan developed an admiration for French culture as a result of his instructor, who had attended art school in Paris. Meanwhile, his political involvement grew, and in May of 1908, when peasant agitation reached Hue, he acted as an interpreter in discussions between the protesters and the government. After fruitless negotiations, French forces crushed the protest. The next day, Tan was kicked out of school. At the time, there was a schism within the Vietnamese patriot movement. On one side, you had Bun Boi Chau, who looked to Japan's Meiji Restoration as a model for resisting Western colonization. On the other side, you had Bun Chu Trinh, who thought it was feasible to collaborate with Bung Chu Trinh and Ku to gain air. Near the boundary between the French colonial provinces of Annam and Cochin China, in the town of Phan Thiet, he began his teaching career in 1910. at the patriotic Duc Thang School. Several months later, Thon abruptly departed from his position as a teacher and traveled to Saigon, the French trading hub in Indochina and colonial Vietnam's capital. There, he got back in touch with his father, who had lost his government job in 1910 due to an assault on a nearby landlord. Thon chose to go from Vietnam and travel to France after receiving support from his father. Working as a chef for the shipping business Chargeur Réuni was his way out of poverty, operating under the alias Van Ba. When Tat Thon, a young man of 21 years old, departed Saigon on June 5, 1911, it would be 30 years before he made it back home. In July of the next year, 1911, he reached Marseille. The majority of his first thoughts of France were favorable. The steamer made many stops throughout France before making her way back to Marseille in September, before its journey back to Asia, with the hope of one day returning to Vietnam to help his fellow countrymen out in a government official capacity. Thon sent a letter to the French president, Armand Fallières, requesting admission to the colonial school in Paris. Thon learned about the rejection of his application upon his return to France a few months later. Thon saw the colonial domination of other European nations in Africa and Asia after working as a gardener at Le Havre for a short time. He then went to sea. It was unexpected for them to visit the U.S. in late 1912 and early 1913. Despite what he had read in his textbooks, he discovered a nation where segregation was still in effect in some areas and where racial conflicts were rampant. Because the nation had seen massive immigration in the second part of the 19th century from many groups, including the Irish, the Italians, the Germans, and others, he met Phan Chu Trinh in Paris and started writing to her while working as a chef in England. In 1914, he was also studying English. Upon the First World War's August commencement, he contended that the Vietnamese should remain neutral until the probable impending fall of French colonialism occurred among the European countries' conflicts. There is little documentation of the period that the man who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh, who was known as Nguyen Tat Thanh while in London, spent in the British city. After returning to France in late air, near the boundary between the French colonial provinces of Annam and Cochinchina in the town of Phan Thiet, he began his teaching career in 1910 at the patriotic Duc Tan School. Several months later, Tan abruptly departed from his position as a teacher and traveled to Saigon, the French trading hub in Indochina and colonial Vietnam's capital. There he got back in touch with his father, who had lost his government job in 1910 due to an assault on a nearby landlord. Tan chose to go from Vietnam and travel to France after receiving support from his father. Working as a chef for the shipping business Chargeurs Réunis was his way out of poverty. Operating under the alias Van Ba, Nguyen Tat Thanh, a young man of 21 years old, departed Saigon on June 5, 1911. It would be 30 years before he made it back home. In July of the next year, 1911, he reached Marseille. The majority of his first thoughts of France were favorable. The steamer made many stops throughout France before making her way back to Marseille in September, before its journey back to Asia. With the hope of one day returning to Vietnam to help his fellow countrymen out in a government official capacity, Tan sent a letter to the French president, Armand Fallières, requesting admission to the colonial school in Paris. Tan learned about the rejection of his application upon his return to France a few months later. Tan saw the colonial domination of other European nations in Africa and Asia after working as a gardener at Le Havre for a short time. He then went to sea. It was unexpected for them to visit the U.S. in late 1912 and early 1913. Despite what he had read in his textbooks, he discovered a nation where segregation was still in effect in some areas and where racial conflicts were rampant. Alankthano because the nation had seen massive immigration in the second part of the 19th century from many groups, including the Irish, the Italians, the Germans, and others. He met Phan Chu Trinh in Paris and started writing to her while working as a chef in England in 1914. He was also studying English. Upon the First World War's August commencement, he contended that the Vietnamese should remain neutral until the probable impending fall of French colonialism occurred among the European countries' conflicts. There is little documentation of the period that the man, who would later be known as Ho Chi Minh, who was known as Nguyen Tat Tan while in London, spent in the British city. After returning to France in late 1917, he made Paris his permanent home. By year's end, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, had taken control of Russia in a communist revolution, and the tyrannical Tsar of Russia had been deposed in the same year. Annamite Patriots was founded by him. Despite members' silence on the part of the French government during WWW1, they drafted a petition to be presented to the Allied leaders at the Paris Peace Conference following Germany's surrender in November 1918, pledging to support Vietnam's right to self-determination and calling for greater political freedom and autonomy. A 29-year-old named Nguyen Tat Tan, also known as Nguyen Ai Quoc or Nguyen the Patriot, was one of the signatories. Quoc was the name that Ho Chi Minh's future self adopted beginning in 1919. That same year, he also became a member of the French Socialist Party, but he quickly grew disillusioned with his fellow party members since they prioritized class conflict above anti-colonialism. Lenin, a Russian native who advocated for a worldwide revolution to free countries and emphasize the significance of the colonial issue, established the Third International, or Comintern, and Quoc planned to get the socialists to join. At the French Socialist Party Congress in December 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc brought attention to the colonial exploitation of France and backed a resolution to join the Third International. This resolution was approved by a majority and resulted in the establishment of the French Communist Party in 1921. In the Intercolonial Union, which Quoc helped establish, he collaborated with people from the French colonies. A prominent writer to the group's weekly publication, Le Paria, he penned The Bamboo Dragon, a satire of the French puppet monarch, Khai Dinh, of Vietnam, in 1922. Because Quoc saw that the French communists and socialists were equally divided on the colonial question by 1923, he resolved to go back to Asia. He touched down in Moscow in July after making it to Soviet Russia on the first stage of his expedition. Unfortunately for him, Lenin suffered a stroke in 1922 that left him unable to work. He would pass away in January 1924. Many think Quoc attended the East Asian University of the Toilers. It is not known if Quoc enrolled or only attended lectures, but the institution did teach future communist leaders from Asia. At the Fifth Congress of the Third International, one of several communist gatherings he attended, he said that stripping imperialist nations of their colonies should be the primary goal of any revolution. This ran counter to Marxist ideology, which posited that a well-organized working class made industrialized nations more susceptible to revolution. Asian peasants, raised with classic Confucian principles like equality, according to Quoc, were just as revolutionary as the working class. He departed Moscow in October 1924 after being appointed as the Comintern's representative to China, a country that had been in chaos since the fall of the Qing dynasty in the south after Yuan's death in 1916, while his northern subordinates fought for control. In order to confront the warlords, Sun sought Soviet aid in assembling an army and forged an alliance with the newly established Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, advisors from the Soviet Union educated cadets at the Whampoa Military Academy, which was headed by Chiang Kai-shek. Conflict between Chiang Kai-shek and the Communists was already brewing when Wen Aikwok arrived in Canton in November 1924. Mikhail Borodin was a Comintern operative in China, and he was his secretary for a while. Around the same time, Kwok was instrumental in the founding of the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League in China. Whampoa was the place where Kwok reconnected with Zhou Enlai, the political commissar of Chiang and a future prime minister of Communist China. The two had met when Kwok was in Paris. Kwok established a school to educate future revolutionaries, with funding from the Chinese Communists. He combined Marxist-Leninist philosophy with traditional Confucian concepts to build an intellectual framework that was suitable for Indo-Chinese situations. In a paper titled The Revolutionary Path, he wed Zhang Suiming, a 21-year-old Chinese midwife, in October 1926 as well. But the joy they had was cut short by political events in China. The Nationalist Party was led by Chiang Kai-shek after Sun Yat-sen's death in March 1925. In April of 1927, he rid the country of its communists. In May of the same year, Kwok abandoned his new wife and returned to Russia. As the Chinese Communist movement was fighting for its own existence, Kwok saw the need for an independent Communist Party in Indochina. And in late June 1928, with the Comintern's blessing, returned to Asia to begin the process of establishing one. The return to Vietnam was not made by Kwok. His destination instead was Thailand, where he touched down in July 1928. During the time when France dominated Indochina to the east, Indochinese nationalists were active out of the tiny Thai kingdom of Siam, which was one of the few minor Asian or African countries that had stayed independent from the colonial powers. When in Thailand, Kwok set his shop in the town of Nakhon Phanom in northeastern Thailand, close to the Laotian border, where many Vietnamese people have settled. During his time here, he tracked events in Vietnam, where 3 distinct communist groups had formed, and watched locals go about their everyday lives. Frustrated with the split, he followed the Comintern's orders and summoned the 3 groups' delegates to a meeting in Hong Kong in December 1929. Upon reaching the British colony, Kwok presided over a 4-day gathering and manifesto. In order to include communists from Laos and Cambodia, the party changed its name to the Indochinese Communist Party in response to demand from the Comintern. Despite having helped create the party, Kwok felt ignored by its leaders and voiced his skepticism over a 1930 party-organized mass peasant revolt that the French swiftly put down. The radicalization of the formerly submissive subject caused concern among the French authorities. French commune residents and initiated a repression campaign against communist revolutionaries. In June 1931, British authorities in Hong Kong detained Kwok, who was posing as a Chinese merchant. Being in British custody was a stroke of luck for him, since it allowed him to hire British attorney Frank Loseby to represent him in court. While Loseby was being treated for TB, Kwok was quickly taken to the hospital. Kwok was stood by his position. Even though he was found not guilty in September 1932, the possibility of his extradition to France remained. Loseby broke the news that his Vietnamese client had died of disease in jail in January 1933, while Kwok fled to Russia via Shanghai in secret. Joseph Stalin, who had outwitted his opponents after Lenin's death, welcomed 44-year-old Nguyen Ai Kwok to the Soviet Union in the spring of 1934. Bak's still death had absolute power. Although Kwok was effusive in his admiration of the country's economic growth, Since his earlier trips in the 1920s, he felt neglected by his fellow Comintern members during his time in Moscow. He begged for permission to return to Indochina many times, but each time he was turned down. During his time in Moscow, he wrote his thesis titled The Land Revolution in Southeast Asia, and he also provided the Vietnamese translation of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. During this time, he also took pleasure in visiting Moscow's museums and theaters on a regular basis, sometimes bringing along Nguyen Thi Minh Khai, a 24-year-old who had been his secretary in Hong Kong a few years before. Despite Kwok's continued legal marriage to his long-absent Chinese wife, evidence suggests he requested permission to marry Khai, and the two lived together as husband and wife in Russia. However, Khai may have given up hope of Kwok ever being formally freed, so that she could marry Indochinese Communist Party leader La Hong Fong in the summer of 1935. On top of that, many faithful Communist Party members and officials were jailed, expelled, or both during Stalin's Great Purge, which occurred during Kwok's stay in Moscow. Or put many personally reacted for where they're different. Or put to death on false accusations of conspiring with Stalin's former enemies, including Leon Trotsky. Kwok was personally summoned before a Comintern disciplinary board of A. After Cheng's nationalist troops assaulted the last communist strongholds in southern China a year before, Mao Zedong created the Chinese Communist Party in October 1935. After the Japanese invasion and control of China's major cities in the east in the second half of 1937, the nationalists and communists reluctantly agreed to temporarily put aside their differences and leading to an uncomfortable ceasefire. Kwok was able to reconnect with Vietnamese revolutionaries in southern China when the Second United Front was formed by nationalists and communists. Not only did Kwok assist in the training of guerrilla troops to combat the Japanese, but he also kept the Comintern apprised of news from China and Indochina. Kunming, in the province of Yunnan, which borders Vietnam in southern China, was where Kwok first established contact with the Indochinese Communist Party in early 1940. From that location, he learned about events in Europe. After a devastating conquering war that began in May 1940, Nazi Germany finally conquered France and coerced its capitulation in July. Given the current political climate in France, with the Nazis firmly entrenched in power in Paris and the North, and the Vichy collaborationist government taking shape in the South, Kwok saw these events as a golden opportunity for the Vietnamese to finally topple the colonial authorities in his homeland. After 30 years of traveling through France, the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Thailand, and Hong Kong, he finally decided to go back to Vietnam. It was becoming more problematic since the Japanese were also starting to continuing and known more. A portion of the French Vichy collaborationist authority remained in Indochina when the United States invaded the area in the fall of 1940 to appease their German allies. Returning to Vietnam after a 3-decade absence, Kwok and other Vietnamese communist fighters arrived into Tonkin on February 8, 1941. He established his stronghold in a cavern at Pak Bo, which is near the Chinese border. Despite their understanding of the need of the Communist-Nationalist partnership in China's war against Japan, They were afraid that Chiang Kai-shek would betray the communists in the end. Despite Kwok's long-standing claims that the movement needed to embrace so-called class foes to achieve national would be much more successful than open conflict, and he thought the rebellion was too soon. Japan attacked the U.S. naval facility at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, drawing the U.S. into the wars that had been going on in the Far East since 1937. At this point, Kwok restated his earlier appeal to the Indochina people to rise up in opposition to the Japanese occupation and the subsequent return of French colonial rule. He ordered the Viet Minh Army to start moving south in the early summer of 1942. Chongqing was the center of the United Nationalist and Communist administration in central China during the war. Kwok went there after organizing the beginning of a communist insurrection against the Japanese in Indochina. Zhou Enlai, an old friend of his among the Chinese communists, lived in the city, and it also served as the site of the Soviet mission to China. General Joseph Stilwell oversaw U.S. operations in the China-Burma-India theater from this location. After the United States entrance into World War II, Ho Chi Minh, which means enlightened will, was Kwok's new identity when he departed for Chongqing on the evening of August 13, 1942. The moniker is still widely recognized today. It was unfortunate that his tenure as Ho Chi Minh was short-lived. He was detained shortly after entering China due to the expiration of his travel authorization for Chinese territory. Over the course of the next year, he was transferred to several jails in southern China, documenting his observations in a journal that included more than 100 little poems. As soon as word got out of Ho's detention, his Vietnamese comrades contacted their Chinese connections. Nonetheless, even when circumstances improved, he was not released until August 17, 1943. Ho made an impression on nationalist General Zhang Fa-Cui, who oversaw the activities of competing Vietnamese nationalist factions, as commander of the 4th Military Command in Guangxi's Liuzhou province. Zhang saw potential in Ho, despite his communist views, and he was appointed head of the Vietnamese nationalist movement. Ho drafted a national revolution plan that united the Indo-Chinese Communist Party and Chinese nationalist supporters. After assisting Zhang in organizing a Vietnamese National Congress in March 1944. "I am a communist, but what is important to me now is the independence and freedom of my country," he told General Zhang before his August 1944 departure for Vietnam. "Opposing communism, I can assure you with absolute certainty that communism will not take root in Vietnam for at least another half-century." In the middle of September, Ho Chi Minh, who was 54 years old, arrived to Pak Bo. As Japan's military Nazis by September, American troops advanced westward and freed Pacific Islands that had been controlled by the Japanese. In December, Ho embarked on a mission to Kunming with Lieutenant Rudolph Shaw, an American pilot who was captured by the Viet Minh after a crash landing, in an effort to acquire American military aid. Japan installed nominally independent monarchies in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in March 1945, removing the last remnants of the French Vichy collaborationist government. This turned the tables on Washington, which had previously paid little attention to the desires of the Indo-Chinese peoples. Ho, however, benefited from this development. As a result, the United States consented to provide the Viet Minh with weapons, and was more likely to accept Ho's offer of collaboration against the Japanese. Ho had already begun ordering new military operations against the Japanese by April 1945. He was backed by the United States. During this time, he was afflicted with malaria and relied on local herbal remedies for his survival. However, other than that, things were looking up as the war in Europe drew to a close in May 1945, and the Allies shifted their focus to defeating the Japanese. This was after Nazi Germany and its other European allies were defeated. Ho learned about the American atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, while he was still recovering from an attack of malaria. Ho convened a national congress in the Viet Minh stronghold at Tan Trao as the Japanese were getting ready to surrender. Those in attendance soon realized that the weak, bearded man identifying himself as Ho Chi Minh was, in fact, Nguyen Ai Quoc, the man many thought had died in Hong Kong jail in 1932. Despite Ho's first efforts to maintain a low profile, few were aware that he was the same person, because of the clandestine way he had orchestrated the Viet Minh's battle against the Japanese since 1940. Ho said that now that the Japanese were out of the picture, the Vietnamese would face fresh independence negotiations with the French. Ho was selected to head a 5-man Provisional National Liberation Committee, which would function as a temporary administration, on August 16th, the day after Japanese Emperor Hirohito proclaimed the Japanese surrender. Afterwards, Ho departed from Tan Trao and headed towards Hanoi, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, were all part of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which he unilaterally formed in early September. Ho Chi Minh finally fulfilled his lifetime dream of guiding Vietnam to independence when he was 55 years old. Still, Ho's new administration was not entirely legitimate, and whether or not France would seek to re-establish its colonial rule over Indochina was an open question. The responsibility of disarming the Japanese in Indochina was passed on to the Chinese nationalists, north of the 16th parallel, by the American, British, and Soviet leaders at the Potsdam Conference in late July. The British Army was stationed south of that line, and the remaining French troops who had been held captive by the Japanese made their way into Saigon. The Vietnamese people, especially the country's social and economic elites, rallied behind Ho's puppet government in the face of these challenges. As part of his efforts to form a wide alliance, Ho sent an invitation to Emperor Bao Dai, who was the last ruler of Vietnam under the Nguyen dynasty, a supreme advisor to his administration for a year until Ho effectively exiled him to China, and who had previously acted as a puppet monarch for Japan during the formation of French colonial control. More than 150,000 Chinese forces invaded northern Vietnam in the fall of 1945 to seize government buildings and communication networks, in accordance with the Potsdam Accords. Vietnamese nationalist groups who supported China forced Ho to reach a compromise. Before the next National Assembly elections in January 1946, they were assured 70 seats. The Viet Minh were able to secure the remaining seats because they had the unwavering backing of the average Vietnamese citizen. North Vietnam saw the outbreak of bloody confrontations between Viet Minh and Chinese soldiers shortly after this first agreement. At the close of World War II, China's internal civil war broke up again between nationalists and communists, and Chiang Kai-shek required more soldiers to wage war. In an effort to reassert their dominance in Indochina, the French negotiated with the Chinese nationalists. Ho Chi Minh had always planned for the French to come back, even before the country's declaration of independence. He realized he needed to talk to them about something. Central to his plan was the idea of recognizing French authority in Indochina for a limited time in return for autonomy and the ultimate transition to a completely independent Vietnam in 5 or 6 years. In an effort to keep the peace, Ho and the French announced Vietnam's designation as a free state at the heart of the French Union in March 1946. Even within the Viet Minh, the deal sparked resistance. Ho and his administration had to rationalize the deal by saying it was a strategic retreat that would help them acquire international credibility. Meanwhile, the Chinese departed from North Vietnam in June 1946, and French forces replaced them. Ho Chi Minh departed for Paris on May 31, 1946, in order to participate in a discussion about the destiny of Vietnam. He performed his responsibilities as Vietnam's head of state in the French capital and emerged victorious. Free colonies proposed by the socialist administration of France, the outcome of which would postpone Vietnam's independence. When I got back to my house, on November 20, 1946, a customs disagreement led to a battle in the northern port of Haiphong, despite some promising early indications. Tensions rose over the next 4 weeks as both sides laid responsibility for the violence at the other's feet. They finally broke midway through December when French parachutists landed in Hanoi. After reaching out to the French colonial government at the last minute, but receiving no response, Ho and the other Viet Minh commanders decided to start the First Indochina War by launching a preemptive attack against the French colonial troops on the evening of December 19th. Even though the French didn't completely occupy Hanoi until March 1947, the communist troops progressively pulled out of the city. Dinh Hoa District, located around 80 miles north of Hanoi in Thanh Nguyen Province, was chosen by Ho in May to be his capital. The Dinh Hoa Safety Zone was a network of tunnels and communities where the Viet Minh would resume their guerrilla war tactics. In spite of this classification, the region was heavily assaulted by the French in October 1947, and Ho barely escaped being captured by the enemy. Ho Chi Minh oversaw the political and military affairs of Vietnam when he was president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He delegated authority for making strategic and tactical decisions to the skilled Viet Minh guerrilla commander Vo Nguyen Giap. In 1950, Ho's force changed its name to the People's Force of Vietnam, following Mao Zedong's instruction that the people and troops should be united like a family. To set an example for his fellow soldiers, Ho urged them to honor the farmers in their area. Colonel Vu Dinh Huynh was frightened one night by a disturbance and shot in the dark from his rifle. When he realized he had shot a water buffalo belonging to a peasant at dawn, Ho had him apologize and pay the victim for his loss. As a show of his government's concern for the people, Ho ordered his ministers to make sure the Hanoi refugees had enough to eat and a safe place to stay despite the chaos of the war. By visiting the front line on occasion, while dressed as a peasant, he was able to see firsthand how the porters who helped supply the troops lived. Ho persisted in making sure the French prisoners of war were well cared for and that they were not allowed to go hungry. Not all of Ho's subordinates shared his generosity, and he had a hard time controlling overzealous security agents who committed arbitrary arrests and killings. As the Cold War escalated between Western liberal democracies and Eastern communism, the Indochina War took on more global importance by the decade's close. The Communists were able to declare the People's Republic of China and compel Chiang Kai-shek to step down in October 1949, marking what Mao in Moscow in 1950 and had his administration recognized by the Soviet Union during his visit to Beijing. The People's Army of Vietnam would receive supplies from China according to an agreement between the two main communist countries. French forces maintained control of the strategically critical RC4 roadway close to the Chinese border, even though the Viet Minh had taken over much of northern Vietnam. While Ho's soldiers began an offensive to take over the road in the latter half of 1950. Chinese instructors taught Vietnamese soldiers in southern China, while senior Chinese commanders advised Ho and his troops on the front lines. Meanwhile, in 1949, France created the state of Vietnam in southern Vietnam, re-establishing Emperor Bao Dai as chief of state. In 1950 and beyond, the Viet Minh's actions were more and more impacted by communist ideology due to their growing links to Moscow and Beijing. In 1951, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party was refounded as the Workers' Party of Vietnam. As the Viet Minh drew closer to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China to secure military aid during the escalating Cold War, the administration of the young Democratic Republic of Vietnam started to take on more of a communist dictatorial style under Ho's leadership. While Ho may have privately voiced his reservations about these changes, He generally heeded Chinese counsel. Huang Tung, chief of the party's propaganda, said that the Chinese intended to fire some officials because they weren't from the working class. Seeing that his chief military commander, Vo Wenjiap, was at the very top, Ho gave the order to burn the list. By 1954, the conflict with France had lasted for more than 7 years, and the French people's enthusiasm for keeping the war continuing was starting to fade. The French launched an operation in the spring to reinforce their position at the Dien Bien Phu citadel in northwest Vietnam, close to the Laotian border, in an effort to cut off the Viet Minh's supply routes into Laos. At Dien Bien Phu, the French intended to provoke a catastrophic engagement with the Vietnamese army. General Giap's forces started attacking the stronghold on March 13, 1954. The People's Army of Vietnam besieged the French garrison and pounded its defenses with the help of Chinese artillery, which included anti-aircraft weapons. The main garrison surrendered on May 7th after Vietnamese troops had been steadily wiping out French outposts for 2 months. Meanwhile, diplomats from the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and the Soviet Union were convening at the Geneva Conference in Switzerland to deliberate the crisis in Korea. The communist North Korea and the anti-communist South Korea had signed an armistice the year before after a 3-year struggle for dominance of the peninsula. In June 1954, the French administration collapsed due to the loss of Dien Bien Phu. The newly appointed prime minister, the appropriately titled Pierre Mendès France, was given the responsibility to evacuate from Indochina. Quickly, a truce was reached, and the 17th parallel was agreed upon as a temporary dividing line between the southern state of Vietnam and the Northern Democratic Republic of Vietnam, both of which were ruled by communists. Earlier in the month, Zhu Enlai departed from Geneva to confer with General Giap and Ho over these suggestions. There may not be a meeting record, but Zhu seems to have been instrumental in getting Ho to agree to the agreement. Recent military adventures in Korea and Vietnam were expensive endeavors, and the Chinese leadership intended to concentrate on economic growth inside China. After 8 years of combat, the Vietnamese army had likewise endured enormous casualties, and Ho was eager to get some relief. In the end, Ho was a realist who understood that gaining world recognition for half of Vietnam was a huge first triumph. Coming to be recognized more and more as North Vietnam, Ho and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's leadership made a triumphant return to Hanoi in October 1954. Land reform became his focus at that point. For decades, the scarcity of land has been a major problem. The center and northern regions of Vietnam were very populous, and the tiny farmers who lived there had very little land to produce. Although land reform had been a party priority since the 1930s, Ho's attempts to foster national harmony prevented it from becoming a reality. Relatively little changed during the early years in conscious rule. Chinese pressure, the Vietnamese communists began to take action in the early 1950s. In November 1953, the Workers' Party of Vietnam declared, quote, "We must abolish the system of colonial land ownership in Vietnam, abolish the system of feudal property, and establish the system of peasant land ownership." In December, Ho signed decrees launching the Land Reform Program. Guided by the experience of the Chinese communists, Ho did not insist on enforcing the new laws immediately, but laid the foundations with an education campaign. The process often entailed widespread accusations and denouncements, breaking the villainously cultivated in wartime. After the end of the war, landlords who supported the Viet Minh were forced to forfeit their assets without compensation. TIMs included veteran party members, many of whom were rich peasants. The land reform movement is believed to have killed between 15,000 and 50,000 people, the majority of whom were found not guilty. While Ho expressed his personal horror at the scale of death and destruction, it was only in the spring of 1956 that the Vietnamese communists began to publicly acknowledge errors in the implementation of the land reform program. The change Vietnamese rule. During the war against the French, Duan had been responsible for political and military operations in the South, and he maintained. In 1958, he made a secret visit to South Vietnam and report the path to revolution in the South, which recommended additional aid to the communists there. In July 1959, North Vietnamese forces invaded Laos in order cornerback to establish a supply route to the south that came to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In September 1960, Lat Duan was formally named as first secretary of the Workers' Party Vietnam as Ho began to step back from some of his responsibilities as he entered his 70s. Hao Chuan and Lat Duc Dol, the chairman of the party's organization department. The two men were supported by General Nguyen Qui Tan, who was head of the political department of the People's Army of Vietnam and took command of communist forces in the South. As chairman of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Ho remained head of state, but as his health declined, he was less powerful than he had been in the 1950s. On the 20th of December 1960, the new party leaders officially established the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, better known as the Viet Cong. Hence began a major intensification of the Second Indochina War, one fought between North Vietnam with Soviet men Power Lawn and Socials and South Vietnam. He was officially a tense of the equipment in 1951, and they Thurmond and Inventions were author in Scening. Between 1961 and 1963, doubted 40,000 communist troops infiltrated the South via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the meantime, U.S. President John F. Kennedy sent military advisors to support the Army of South Vietnam. In 1963, as page of French diplomatic initiative to create a federation of North and South Vietnam, which federally be neutral in the Cold War, Ho corresponded with Diem and was keen to come to an agreement, praising his rival as a patriot who opposed French rule. The Kennedy administration was sufficiently alarmed and authorized a coup that overthrew Diem in November 1963. His fall created a power vacuum, and several South Vietnamese military officers struggled for power until General Nguyen Van Thieu seized power in 1965. The de facto collapse of the Army of South Vietnam in 1963 and 1964 prompted the direct intervention of American forces in August 1964. Up until this point, the role of the U.S. had been as supposed military advisors, though the scale of the American presence in South Vietnam. A. B. Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy after the latter's assassination on the 22nd of November 1963, began sending hundreds of thousands of American troops into Vietnam. The Second Indochina War was now developing into an outright confrontation between the Viet Cong and the United States, with South Vietnam simply acting as the base of operations for the U.S. At home in America, a draft of conscript troops was introduced, and at its peak in 1968 and 1969, there would be over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. Before that, in March 1965, American and South Vietnamese craft launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained campaign to bomb the North Vietnamese submission. The war would eventually spill over into Laos and Cambodia, with Johnson and his successor Richard Nixon engaging in bombing missions in the two neighboring countries when the Viet Cong began using those countries for marching south and resupplying their positions in South Vietnam. It would all be to zero effect. The Viet Cong had perfected the guerrilla warfare needed to defeat the Goliath. That was the U.S. military, and anti-American sentiment amongst the South Vietnamese had escalated to the point where the Americans Huawei were fighting to allegedly defend a people who didn't want them there in the first place. While all this was occurring, a severe split had opened up in the communist world between the Sina and the Soviet Union after Mao criticized Khrushchev for repudiating Stalin's legacy. With his country at war and battling poor health, Ho, who was no longer playing a hugely active role in guiding the Viet Cong war effort, found a new role, acting as a mediator in the Sino-Soviet disputes. As a communist moderate, Ho's personal sympathies lay with Khrushchev. However, his country shared a border with China and relied primarily on Mao's government for military and logistical support against the U.S. Hence, Ho was playing a delicate balancing game in the 1960s. He was also personally reliant on the Chinese. During the 1960s, he made regular trips to China for medical treatment for a variety of ailments which could not be well treated in North Vietnam, a poor agricultural society still, in those days, that was eased prevented from development by the necessities of the war effort. He met Mao for the last time in 1965, while China was reluctant to provide direct military aid and the North Vietnamese were reluctant to accept it. In 2017, the Chinese government officially acknowledged that 320,000 Chinese soldiers were sent to North Vietnam, and they were involved in combat duties alongside the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. Even after Khrushchev was toppled in a coup in 1964, Soviet aid to Vietnam continued in the form of aircraft and ground-to-air missiles. Ho played his part well in ensuring that the Soviets and Chinese both supported North Vietnam throughout the Sino-Soviet split. With the Soviet and Chinese aid continuing apace and with a massive anti-war movement at home in America severely hampering the U.S. war effort, on the 30th of January 1968, the North Vietnamese Regular Army and the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, named after the Lunar New Year skeptic festival of Tet in Vietnam. This massive attack against over 100 targets across South Vietnam took the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies completely by surprise. They knew the North and the North Vietnamese were proving a strong adversary, but they had not expected a massive coordinated offensive of this kind. The Tet Offensive went on in an aggressive phase through the spring and summer of 1968, and then it fizzled out over the autumn. Strategically, it was a failure for the Communists. They had hoped that a major counteroffensive would trigger revolts among the South Vietnamese, who would then expel the Americans from the country with Viet Cong aid and BAT. However, the popular revolt never materialized, and tens of thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers were killed or injured in the campaign. However, from a propaganda perspective, the Tet Offensive was a great victory for Ho's government, as it turned an already disillusioned American public completely against the war in Vietnam, as it became wholly clear that talk of imminent victory emanating from the White House was pure fantasy. Instead, the American commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, estimated that a further 200,000 men were required to win the war. American public support for the war collapsed, and in March 1968, at the height of the Tet Offensive, President Johnson sought to begin peace negotiations to end the war. Peace negotiations to end the Vietnam War and finally bring about full Vietnamese independence. Ho had started fighting against Japan and the French back in the early 1940s. Commenced traverse in Paris had dragged on for years, in large part because Richard Nixon dedicated Johnson as President of the United States early in 1969, refused to make major concessions, despite having won the U.S. election on vague promises of ending the war in Vietnam. Ho would never take part in the peace negotiations in any concerted way. By the time they commenced, he was an elderly man in his late 70s and in increasingly poor health. After he celebrated his 79th birthday in May 1969, his health deteriorated during the summer, and he died of heart failure on the 2nd of September 1969, the 24th anniversary of the foundation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945. Against his wishes, his body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Hanoi, which was completed in August 1975, after the end of the Vietnam War. He is believed to have died childless. His marriage to Jiang Sui-ming had legally never due at watch ended, though they had not reunited in any way after separating when Reclaimed left for the Soviet Union back in the late 1920s, despite a few relationships thereafter. had never remarried or fathered legitimate children, though there are unconfirmed stories of Mabani illegitimate children, one centering on Nung Duk Man, a figure born in 1940 who is rumored to have been born to Ho and his housekeeper from that time, Nung Duk Dung. He would go on to serve as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam between 2001 and 2011. The period following Ho Chi Minh's death would see his dream of an independent and united Vietnam realized. Even by the time of his death in 1969, it was clear that the United States, for all its airy might and the troop surges it had engaged in, could not win what is known simply as the Vietnam War in America. Moreover, the draft system which had been introduced in the U.S. had created a movement, and public support for the conflict was very low. Indeed, Richard Nixon had entered the White House in 1969 on promises that he would end the war and bring America's soldiers home. In the end, this was easier said than done. It took several years to begin a tactical withdrawal, and even then, a full cessation to hostilities was hard to square with efforts to arrest Thich Nhat at Nam out of the Soviet camp in the Cold War. Peace negotiations continued through the 1970s, though with little breakthrough. That is until January 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords enshrined an initial plan for peace between the North Vietnamese, the Americans, and their wholly corrupt allies in South Vietnam. With this done, American forces gradually began withdrawing. As U.S. cloned on the ground declined, the North Vietnamese began preparing a new campaign. The 1975 Spring Offensive actually started in December 1974. By the late spring, as the last American troops were withdrawn from the South, the Viet Cong forces descended on Saigon. In the end, after the long war they had fought and the enormous resources expended, the last U.S. officials ended up fleeing in helicopters and planes as the Viet Cong entered the capital of South Vietnam on the 30th of April 1975. Just over a year later, in July 1976, Le Duan proclaimed the establishment of the Unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the late Vietnamese leader. The Communist Party of Vietnam remains in power in Vietnam today, the People's Republic of China. The political system here is more of a form state-controlled, socialist-oriented market economy rather than it being a communist country. The leader of Communist North Vietnam, who led the fight against French and U.S. forces during the Vietnam War, also known as the First and Second Indochina Wars. Over the course of his long life, Ho adopted many different names, perhaps dozens of aliases in all, but named for little more than a few weeks. But his focus on the goal of achieving independence for his native country was singular. He first achieved international recognition as Nguyen Ai Quoc in 1919 when he presented the Vietnamese people's demands for autonomy at the Paris Peace Conference. While he embraced communism as his preferred means to overthrow French colonial rule, was willing to make ideological concessions in the name of unifying the Vietnamese people. Although he spent much of his life outside Vietnam, primarily in the Soviet Union and China, Ho laid these opposition to the French and Japanese during the Second World War, enabling him to proclaim the foundation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945. During the remainder of his life, Ho led his country through two wars. Firstly, against the French attempt to restore colonial authority, and secondly, against South Vietnam and its American ally. Although he did not live to see the eventual victory against the Unified Minds in 1975 and the unification of the country under communist rule shortly thereafter, the modern-day Socialist Republic of Vietnam would not have existed without him. What do you think of Ho Chi Minh? Was he first and foremost a Vietnamese nationalist who was guided by a lifelong desire to cast off foreign rule in his native country? Or was he a communist dictator whose ideology influenced his approach towards his internal and external enemies? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.